Okay, for today's masterclass, I am pretty excited. We're going to talk about some things that we see bishops wearing during Mass or during liturgy. A couple of them kind of spill over into what they normally wear, like in their day-to-day activities. But we want to look at the things that they're wearing during Mass. So if you've ever been to a Mass with a bishop, you know that things just look different with the vestments that he wears. He wears some things that are typical of priests that priests also wear, and we'll talk about that stuff tomorrow, next week. But for now, just to look at the things that are specific to the bishop. So we'll start from the top. So at the very top of his head, bishops wear what's called a mitre. So a mitre is this fancy hat that he wears that's got the two pointy things on the top, and sometimes they're taller, sometimes they're shorter, and then on the back side there's these two little flappy things that just kind of dangle off the back of his head. And again, if you're unfamiliar with this, it can seem, or if you've ever wondered about it, like it can be like, yeah, why does the bishop wear this funny looking hat? What's that about? And actually there's something really fascinating about this, that the bishop's mitre has its origin in the Old Testament. So again, so many things we do go back to the worship that God gave to Moses, that he gave instructions for. And the high priest, who was the one priest who could go into the Holy of Holies to offer the sacrifice of atonement on the day of Yom Kippur, the high priest, among the different vestments that he was to wear, was told to wear a turban. Sometimes the translation actually is a mitre, but he was told to wear this headgear that symbolized his office. It symbolized, so among the vestments that he wore, all of them symbolized that this is the high priest. The other priests might wear vestments, they might offer sacrifice, but the high priest had some vestments that were a step above everyone else. And if you remember, we talked about how Jesus is the eternal high priest. And it's not just that we talked about this, but the scriptures talk about this, how Jesus is the eternal high priest. And something that the Catholic Church has believed from the beginning is that priests share in the high priesthood of Jesus. And above the priests are bishops who share more fully in the high priesthood of Jesus. And so they're given vestments that match the dignity and signify the office of their high priesthood with Jesus. And the mitre is one of those things. And so the mitre is something that the bishop wears during Mass on top of his head, and he takes it off at different points out of respect for what's going on in the liturgy. But anyway, that's the thing. And the way that our mitre is now, or the way that the bishop's mitre is now, the design of it, comes from the Roman Empire. So in the Roman Empire, different things developed in the way that they wore their hats and that kind of thing. Because the bishops weren't the only ones who wore, fancy hats. Sometimes other officials would wear fancy hats. Just a couple of things I learned about this. The 2 points on the top of the mitre, and as well as the 2 flappy things, they symbolize possibly 2 different things. The first is they symbolize the Old Testament and the New Testament, or we could say the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, which is significant that the priest is making that connection and living out that connection between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, kind of what we've been talking about. They also can symbolize the spiritual order and the temporal order. That is to say that the bishop is in charge, of course, of the spiritual order of his diocese, but he's also in charge of governing his diocese, of governing the resources that he has, whether it's with his priests or his financial resources or the properties in his diocese. He's in charge of those things as well. It's a pretty big burden, actually, that the bishop has to carry, that he's responsible for so much in a large territory of land. Okay, so that's the mitre. Underneath the mitre is this skull cap type thing called a zucchetto. And this is actually a fascinating thing, that priests, technically speaking, could wear a zucchetto, like a black zucchetto. The Pope wears a white zucchetto, this skull cap looking thing. And bishops usually wear something that's like magenta colored or reddish of sorts. Cardinals wear red ones, actually. But anyway, the zucchetto, it has its origins, again, the priests in old times they received what's called a tonsure, which is like a ceremonial shaving of the skull. So part of entering into the priesthood or entering into the episcopacy, which is what we call the bishophood, is of course this commitment to living celibately. And so living celibately, you're called to not care as much about how you look. And so they would ceremonially shave the skull, not shave off the skull, but just shave the hair of the skull from the clergy. And so they would wear the tonsure, so they would have hair around the side of their heads, but not on top. And so, of course, not having hair on top of your head, you could imagine that in cold weather you get very cold. Or like when the sun is shining down on you, you might get sunburned. And so they developed this zucchetto so that the bishops could be given a little bit of warmth in the cold weather and protected from the sun in warm weather. So anyway, so that's the zucchetto that the bishop wears, and the bishop, of course, wears that during Mass, and not as much otherwise. Although I think maybe like in official functions, he might still wear his zucchetto and not his mitre. The mitre is really just for Mass or other liturgy type things, liturgy of the hours. But anyway, that's what's going on there, the zucchetto. And then, okay, from there, you slide down around his neck, and you have what's called the pectoral cross. And the pectoral cross is something that the bishop wears pretty much all the time, whether he's in Mass or out of Mass. If you see the bishop with the pectoral cross out of Mass, you're going to see him wearing like a big chain with a cross that it just stands out, you know. And some bishops today they'll wear the cross and they'll put the cross part in their pocket or something so that it doesn't dangle around. Although I like it when bishops wear, and I think the church would like this too, when bishops wear their cross and just let it hang on their chest, hang in the pectoral area, as a reminder to them that they bear a burden, actually. The burden of all souls in their diocese, not just Catholic souls. All souls in their diocese, bishops are spiritually responsible for them. And so the pectoral cross is something that reminds them of this fact. And someone told me this recently, that there's usually not meant to be a corpus, like we have our crucifix with the body of Christ on it. There's not meant to be a corpus on the pectoral cross because the bishop is meant to be like in union with the corpus. He's meant to be the corpus on the cross. He's meant to be that sacrifice. So anyway, so like I said, you see a bishop wearing one outside of the context of Mass. There's going to be just like a longer chain with the cross that hangs over his chest. If you see a bishop wearing one during Mass, you're going to see him wearing something with like a little bit more fancy of a cord type thing that again will still have the cross that he will wear over himself. And so again, that's like he's meant to be reminded all the time that he's bearing this burden, which is a real burden that he's meant to carry with Jesus, of course. You know, it's always with Jesus, that Jesus is going to provide grace, but the bishop is meant to be most fully united to Jesus in his ministry, in his duty, in his carrying out of the office that he occupies. Okay, then if you slide down his right arm into his hand, the bishop will wear what's called an episcopal ring. And that episcopal ring, I have one here, is just a ring that the bishop is given that he puts on his hand, again, as a sign of his authority. So in the Roman Empire, Roman officials would wear rings as a sign of their authority, the office that they occupied with whatever it was within the empire. And they would oftentimes also use that ring, maybe like an engraving on the ring, as like a seal. So if they sent a letter, they would engrave their seal into the wax that they used to kind of bind up the envelope. And then people knew that this is where it comes from. So anyway, so the Roman Catholic Church has its base in Rome, and so you can imagine how bishops and other practices that we have developed from the Roman Empire. And so bishops also began to wear rings as a sign of their authority and also as a sign of the office that they occupy. And they would use, each bishop would have like kind of his own ring, and they would use the seal, the imprint of their ring as a seal for the wax that they would put over correspondence that they were sending out to their diocese or to other bishops or that kind of thing. So that's just kind of a neat thing. And there's actually a common custom in the history of the church of kissing the bishop's ring, not to honor the bishop so much as to honor Christ and the office that Christ has given to this bishop. And it's kind of fallen out of practice, although some people are still doing it. They would still do it today. When they shake the bishop's hand, the ring is on his right hand, and so they would shake the bishop's hand, and then they would bend over and kiss the ring so as to honor the office of the episcopacy of the bishop. So you might consider doing that if ever the occasion arises that you meet a bishop outside of Mass and have a chance to greet him and show him honor. But anyway, so that's the episcopal ring that the bishop wears. And then the last thing is the bishop uses what's called a crozier. Which is like a stick, a big stick that's got kind of a fancy thing on top. And this crozier is what would be used by a shepherd. So as much as the bishop is in charge of the temporal aspect of his diocese, that is to say the governing and the use of resources, he is also the spiritual shepherd of his diocese. Jesus is the good shepherd, and the bishop is meant to be most united to Jesus, the good shepherd. And so the bishop's task is to protect and defend his flock. The bishop's task is to govern his flock and to give them guidance and direction and organization. And so the bishop during Mass carries the crozier as a sign of this fact, that he is meant to use this thing with his authority in a Christ-like way, and so to use it lovingly. But sometimes shepherds need to use their stick, their staff, to discipline the sheep, because they might want to stray, and so the shepherd needs to use his staff sometimes to guide them and to redirect them back to the flock. So anyway, the bishop carries that staff as a sign of that authority, a symbolic thing of his being a shepherd for his diocese, just as Christ is the good shepherd. You think of Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, there's nothing I shall want. The bishop represents the Lord. We know that he's not God, but he represents the Lord, and so he carries a shepherd. Jesus is the good shepherd. The bishop represents Jesus in that way. So anyways, I hope this was helpful for you to just learn. And if you have never been to a Mass with a bishop, then maybe a confirmation would be a great opportunity to go to that, because bishops usually are the ones who confirm, as well as maybe going to like one of your big diocesan masses in your home cathedral, which would be like the Chrism Mass, or even like the big holy days, Christmas or Easter, to go and to be with the bishop and to see him in action, we could say, but to be under his care during that Mass. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. We'll talk more about vestments next week. We'll see you then. Peace.